Thanks everyone for being here. It's on a beautiful afternoon outside. So, one of the things that I think is the obvious first question is, what makes a great neighborhood? And we have a lot of ideas about that, but we also wanted to hear from all of you, what does make a great neighborhood? Does anybody want to try to take a shot at articulating that? How about you, Chris? And we have a microphone as well. So. We hopefully have a microphone that works.
I don't think I can answer it in short order, which we probably have a good short answer, so I'll turn it back to you. As I was saying, I live in Davis Square, which has a lot of the attributes that I think make a very livable place. It's a combination of dense residential, public transportation, and amenities that make life quite convenient. However, that's not exactly a definition.
No, well, that leads us into, a follow-up question to that is, are there places in the Boston area that would be considered great neighborhoods, the Davis Square area being one of them? Are there other areas that folks would like to sort of nominate as a great neighborhood in this area? Just feel free to shout them out or call over the microphone.
The Old West End of Boston.
The Old West End.
Roslindale.
Roslindale. Jamaica Plain. Cambridge, in aggregate.
Why are these the neighborhoods that come to mind for you?
There's a good pedestrian scale. A good pedestrian scale to the environment there.
Mix of uses, dense residential, walkable. Right. Green space, public transportation. People, that's right. Maybe a diversity of people. Now the next question that I have is, have we built any great neighborhoods in the Boston region since World War II? Can anybody think of? I honestly can't think of very many, so I would like to hear about nominations. The Charlestown Naval Yard? Yeah, there's some mill redevelopment projects that I think are pretty nice. Any other new, new developments of scale that might be considered a neighborhood that folks would call a great neighborhood?
The redo of downtown Waltham over the last 35 years.
Great.
Which saved something that was about to grow.
That's right. Any other thoughts? Well, I think what this speaks to is the fact that I can think of some very nice individual projects, but as a whole, I can't think of very many neighborhoods that have been developed. And in part, that's because we're an older part of the country and we have a lot of historic neighborhoods, but we've also built a lot. We haven't stopped building since World War II, and yet we haven't developed many places that have a sense of place to them. So, part of, of what we're trying to do at the Smart Growth Alliance is try to get a better handle around why not? How do you make, in this day and age, better places? So, when I talk about smart growth, there's some characteristics that we talk about generally about smart growth. A place that, what is smart growth? And we usually say not just smart growth, but smart and equitable growth. Sustainable and equitable growth. Generally, I would say that those are places that have choices, that offer people who live their choices. There's choices in terms of housing, so a variety of housing types and opportunities. There's choice in terms of transportation, whether it's walking, biking, transit, or car. They're convenient and vibrant places. There's a certain street life. There's a mix of uses. There's a human scale to them. And ideally, they also provide a healthy lifestyle. Walking is part of that, but also access to green space, to good food. These things are important. So, a little bit of background about the Massachusetts Smart Growth Alliance. We were founded in 2003 by 7 policy organizations, ranging from environmental groups to affordable housing groups to the Regional Planning Agency of Boston, as well as the Boston Society of Architects, which is one of our member organizations. And, you know, in general, we're focused on connecting people to place. And the way that we do that is largely through state policy. And we do that through legislation, regulation, and directing funding to the right kinds of projects. Some of the campaigns that we have relate to reforming land use, relate to sustainable transportation, as well as revitalization and brownfields issues. At the same time, one of our members is MAPC, the Metropolitan Area Planning Council, and as many of you know, they are the regional planning agency for Greater Boston. They're a planning group. Many of you also may know and may have participated in some of their sessions, but they have a planning process for the region called Metro Future. And over the past 5 or so years, they have been meeting with literally thousands of people to talk about the regional future of Boston. And this is something that has been used in more and more metropolitan areas around the country. It's called blueprint planning. It's essentially saying, what are our trends? What are our baseline trends? Is that where we want to be? And then engage people around different scenarios, sort of business as usual types of scenarios or preferred alternatives or other kinds of alternatives. So fortunately, they've actually completed this process. There have been about, I think, 5,000 people, nearly 5,000 people have participated in some of the sessions. And we actually have established a vision. And the vision has some excellent principles that I think we can all agree upon. I don't know if you can read that, but essentially be responsible stewards of our natural resources, build safe, healthy, and welcoming communities, give people affordable and convenient options for living, working, and playing, involving more people, so civic engagement, ensuring a certain fairness in the costs and benefits of development in the region, as well as creating a world-class region that can be globally competitive. And as I mentioned, there's been, what's been produced has been a vision with a lot of goals, a lot of implementation strategies, and a certain constituency. But it's brought us to a certain level. Essentially, we have a map of the region, we have some preservation areas and some developed areas identified, as well as some possible nodes of future development according to a preferred scenario, which is what, through the civic engagement process, they came up with. And really, it is a smart growth scenario, I would say. It focuses development and growth along certain corridors and in certain nodes. However, being a planning agency with no regulatory authority of any kind, the question remains, how do we implement a regional plan for Greater Boston? So part of what the Smart Growth Alliance has done to respond to this opportunity that we have is to say, well, how do we bring these big ideas at the regional level, these state policy campaigns that are 35,000 feet up in the air, how do we make it relevant for people who live in the Boston area? And in our opinion, it's by bringing it down to the neighborhood level. It's by making it real for folks on their street and in their neighborhoods. And there's a lot of trends moving in the right direction that we have to build upon if we can take advantage of them. Many of you may be familiar with what's happening at the federal level. There's a partnership between Housing and Urban Development, the Department of Transportation, and the Environmental Protection Agency. This is pretty landmark in terms of the federal government, very innovative, and there's some very good people leading this effort. And what they are trying to do is some of the first steps towards coordinating how these agencies work, because it seems like a basic idea, but the fact is the federal government does not coordinate its housing and land use policies, its urban development policies, with its transportation policies and with its environmental protection policies. So for the first time, they are trying to communicate among the federal agencies, and it's a heavy lift, but they're moving in the right direction. One of the first things that they're trying to do is rolling out a program called the Federal Sustainable Communities Initiative. And this is a grant program of about $150 million that will be made available through competitive grants for metropolitan regions to either do blueprint planning, or as we've seen, MAPC has already done some of this, to implement those plans. So again, we have a real opportunity there to be competitive for it. And over the next few months, this region will need to put together a proposal to compete for those funds. National foundations are moving in the same direction as well. And Boston really has an opportunity to be a leader here. There are also some larger trends that we have that are quite important. One of them is climate change. How are we as a region going to address climate change? 40% of our region's greenhouse gases is produced by the transportation sector. And even though we're not a region that is growing much in terms of population, we continue to sprawl outward and develop at the fringe on larger lots. So climate change is an issue. How are we going to shift our development patterns? Energy security is an issue. 2 years ago, in 2008, when prices skyrocketed to $4 a gallon for gasoline, people were left wondering, what alternative do I have? How can I reduce the amount of time that I'm spending in the car and the amount of times that I get into the car? And a lot of people realized that there's only so much that they can do given the built environment that we have. We forget quickly, but that challenge is still there and will become relevant again when the economy rebounds. And then on the positive side, in terms of not just challenges that we have, but I think there's a growing demand for it, a market demand for what I would term the smart growth product. There's about 30% of the market wants to live in a walkable neighborhood with a mix of uses, sort of an urban environment, and yet we're vastly underproducing housing for that segment of the market. So if you look at eastern Massachusetts right now, over the last 30 years, and project it also out into the future for the next generation, you'll see something that's pretty startling to me. Less than 5% of what the housing that we've produced is on quarter-acre lots or less. So the question might be, many people would say, well, that's because the market's producing what people want. However, there have been plenty of studies, market studies, shown that as I mentioned, we're underproducing it. Nationwide, we've shown that until 2030, we've produced the amount of large homes on large lots that we need until the year 2030. If we built no more, we wouldn't need any more until 2030. However, we haven't built smaller homes on smaller lots, and we haven't built this smart growth product that I'm talking about, which is more of the sort of the multifamily urban environment. And if you look at the state of Massachusetts as a whole, again, the question is, why haven't we done that? There are some serious barriers to this kind of, more walkable neighborhood, production of more walkable neighborhoods and housing. And so if you look at this map, you see it's probably hard to read, but in red, and there's a lot of the state that's swathed in red, those communities have predominantly minimum lot sizes of 2 acres or more. The orange are communities that are predominantly zoned for 1 to 2 acre lots, and the grayish communities are ones that are predominantly zoned less than 1 acre, which is it's a small minority of the state. Now, if you look below in terms of actual production, however, you'll note that in the places where we're creating housing that's less than 1 acre, we've created over 28,000 new residential units and we've consumed about 15,000 acres as a result of that. If you look at the area that's predominantly zoned for 2-acre lots or higher, we've only produced about 20,000 units, and yet the total parcel acres is over 53,000, nearly 54,000 acres consumed. So obviously, it's a much more efficient way to go if we can produce more housing if we change our zoning. The irony of it is that many of these, the communities that have large minimum lot sizes are also the communities that are growing the fastest. And as a response to this development pressure, they are upzoning their land. But what this shows is that doesn't actually stop growth. What it does is consumes more of your landscape. So a challenge that we have here in the state. So the Alliance looks at this, and again, we operate on the state level and a policy level, and we've been really trying to grapple with the fact, how do we get better outcomes on the ground built? Massachusetts, I'm constantly in forums and go to national conferences where Massachusetts is sort of highlighted as a state with some terrific smart growth policies. And we've had some notable successes on the policy side of things, but it doesn't feel to us like it's translated to much on the ground. And so some of the thinking that we have lately is, how do we connect better to the local innovators? Because there are a lot of local innovators, there are a lot of very active folks in their communities who care about the future of their communities and are working to improve it. At the same time, those local innovators are not connected to the policy apparatus. They're not connected to the systemic change that's necessary, the solutions that are necessary in order to have a real impact. So what's missing is this middle ground, this bridging between the local innovation and the policy innovation. And we're hoping that the Smart Growth Alliance can help play a role in bridging those two worlds. There's really a need to have a mutually beneficial relationship among what's happening at the local level and what's happening at the state level. Where's the regional, where's the implementation piece of it? Because frankly, it can be a very mutually beneficial relationship. If we have better state policies that are successful, it's going to make more things happen on the ground and be successful. If more things happen on the ground, better projects move forward, it's going to build a constituency for better policy. And what we need to do is really focus on creating that positive feedback loop. So we've created an initiative and have gotten some multi-year funding to start looking at this, precisely this issue. How do we create great neighborhoods in a systemic way? So we're just a few months into it, and in year one, which is basically a research and outreach and a program design year, there was a few things that we're trying to do. One, on the research side, is take a look at national best practices, because there are other parts of the country, I don't want to reinvent the wheel, there are other parts of the country who have started to look at these issues in the same way. And we were in part inspired by an initiative called the Great Communities Collaborative out in the San Francisco Bay Area. And what they did was, unlike us, they had a voters approved by petition a several $billion expansion of their transit system, in part because they don't have one, and it's a nightmare to get around by car around the Bay region. So they've approved funding of several $1 billion to expand their transit system, resulting in about 75 new stations that need to be planned and developed. So the advocacy groups in the region decided that they would come together and try to influence these so that they could become as good station areas as possible. And they've been very effective at doing that planning. Implementation's another thing, but that was sort of the inspiration for getting us thinking along the same lines. We have a great transit system in many places. We have great neighborhoods, and we mentioned some of them earlier in the presentation. But what we haven't done is fully leverage them. We haven't improved them recently, or we haven't grown in ways that will make them better. There's some other ones that we're looking at. We're looking at the Twin Cities. We're looking at efforts in Seattle. And one example of this is that the Seattle effort's very interesting. It's the Cascade Land Conservancy, which is an environmental group. And as an environmental group, they were struggling with how do they preserve the natural resources and character of the Cascades around Seattle. This is what it looks like right now in terms of current land use patterns. If population pressures, and it's a fairly rapidly growing area, continue, then they're looking at a long time horizon. So in 2100, they're saying this is what it's going to look like. It's really going to start overrunning our natural resource areas. It's going to change the character of our communities right now. What can we do about it as an environmental organization? And they realized that they needed to concentrate a growth and development in certain areas. And they felt that through their research process, that there could be a better outcome. Again, much like the regional planning that Metro Future has done and MAPC has done. So they decided that what they were going about doing this all wrong. I mean, they're strictly a land conservation group, and they've been a very successful one, but they realized that in order to have a real impact on the Cascade region, they needed to preserve 1.3 million acres of resource land in order to achieve this kind of outcome. That cost would be, in today's terms, about $7 billion. Obviously, that would be impossible for them to do. So they realized that instead, they need to have an urban policy. They, as an environmental group, need to be more effective at directing growth and helping municipalities plan better, grow better, and they also decided that they had a responsibility to educate citizens to become what they term YIMBYs, yes in my backyard, types of activists, because when you show up to public participation forums around development, you always get the people who are oppose things. You don't very often get the people who are actually in favor of them. So the challenge that they face, which I think is the challenge faced by every single region in this country, is how to accommodate regional growth in particular neighborhoods. So that's some of the kinds of national best practices that we're looking at. And in fact, we're going to have a convening in early June to bring some of these folks to the Boston area. And at the end of the presentation, I'll give you all the information for that. We would welcome you to participate. Secondly, we want to try to identify what are the smart growth opportunities in the greater Boston region. So we're starting to undertake a scan of the greater Boston region and try to identify what some of those areas might be. Once we identify that universe, and I'm throwing out here just some illustrative examples of the typology that we might be using, the types of developments we might be looking at, and for example, corridors. There's the Orange Line, which many of the stations along the Orange Line are really underutilized, underdeveloped. The Green Line expansion through Somerville. The Fairmount Line, which if some of you may not be familiar with, but is basically activating a commuter rail line that goes through some of the most disadvantaged and underserved by transportation neighborhoods of the city of Boston, and reactivating it as more of a mass transit line. There's large-scale redevelopments like the Naval Air Station in Weymouth, or the Lynn Waterfront, Westwood Station, which is around 95, Interstate 95, the South Boston waterfront, Seaport area. And then even in our suburban areas, there was a real challenge that we face. How do we grow our oftentimes beautiful town centers or village centers? How do we expand them? How do we continue to make them vibrant places and not only rest on the laurels of the historic character, but really continue to improve and become more vibrant places? And then, of course, there are revitalization areas, particularly in our mill cities of the state. So I wanted to take, also, I'll take a moment in just a second to get some feedback from all of you, but once we identify the universe of opportunities that might be out there in terms of creating new great neighborhoods or larger great neighborhoods, we're going to try to run them through through a filter, we need to prioritize them in some way. Obviously, we can't work with every location, but how do we have the largest impact in a shorter period of time? So we're going to need to develop some selection criteria. And here are some initial ideas about what would be part of those selection criteria. Obviously, scale in terms of how large is the opportunity. Do we have the possibility of impacting our current development patterns? Can we shift them? Obviously, the ability of us as advocates to make a difference, or is something going to happen anyways, will be a factor in whether we would get involved, I would hope. Does it reinforce and advance the larger policy goals for systemic change? Equity is a critical important. Are we going to make sure that we don't just gentrify, but do we create neighborhoods for everyone? And housing and transportation are critical components that need to be addressed. Climate change, and then the last one that we're thinking of is obviously the strength of local partners, because we as the Alliance, we are policy organizations. We are never going to be local implementation folks. We're never going to be developers. We're never going to be community organizers, but we need to partner with those folks. We are committed to working with resident-driven initiatives to implement good planning process and good development. So, at that time, I just would like to solicit a little bit of feedback from folks about what we've said so far, and in particular, get your feedback about both the selection criteria that you see here. Are there things that we're missing that are really important for us to look at when we look at sites? Or are there sites that we should examine? Where are there opportunities in the Boston area that you're familiar with? So can I open it for a moment, and does anybody have any thoughts about that? Chris?
Yes, I'm wondering if you have considered the upcoming change in demographics, age demographics, over the next 20 to 30 years, where we get to a situation where the population is much older, and the smallness of the working age population is such that immigration becomes actually something that most industrial countries are competing for people to bring into the country. Yep. So you have, it almost seems like solving for what you can see around you right now, but if the future is much different, how does that enter into the sort of planning ideas?
Right. Well, just a couple of thoughts responding to that. The aging of our country is we've heard a lot about it in terms of the healthcare discussions, but it's also a huge issue in terms of our physical landscape. As more people age, there's also more people who want to age in place. We don't have the facilities to handle the changing demographics. So we need to create communities where people can age in place. And frankly, those kinds of places are places where they tend to be walkable neighborhoods. There's some stores nearby. There's a sense of community. They're not isolated. They don't need to get into a car. That's one thing. And for that reason, it's been very interesting. But the AARP has become a very active proponent of smart growth nationally for this very reason. One thought. In terms of immigration, I think that you'll see if you look at a lot of particularly in our smaller cities of the state, their populations are growing. They were declining for a long time with deindustrialization as the mills closed. The population, there was a lot of flight, people were leaving. Now you're seeing a lot of those cities are coming back, and they're coming back because of immigrant populations. That's where you're getting a lot of small business activity and affordable housing in these places that the immigrants are attracted to. We haven't really harnessed that in any kind of an effective way, and I agree, both of those issues are ones that we need to deal with. Any other thoughts? Yep, over there, Aviva, on the right side. Thank you. I'm sure.
So I'm on the Cambridge Planning Board, and we think about this in Cambridge. So two things strike me. Is the role of jobs, having people being able to walk to work. Our growth areas in Cambridge are in the eastern part of the city. They're the growth in jobs and the growth in housing at a higher density. And we have one area which should be on your list, which is called North Point, which is actually in Cambridge, Somerville, and Boston, and is at a standstill because of problems with the landowner. And that needs, there's a plan there that the cities have approved, which may fall apart and needs some help.
Thank you. That's a good point. North Point. Just curious, Aviva, before you leave, I just actually have a follow-up question. And how do you feel in general about the North Point, how that was planned and the results that you got?
I think it made a lot of sense. It's kind of for those that don't know North Point, it's about 2/3 the size of Back Bay. And it was kind of a warped version of Back Bay with a central open space and several blocks of development on either side, mixing residents and jobs, but mostly residential. We got a brilliant planner to do that work, and that made a huge difference. And he believed in blocks, in walking, in retail, in smart growth.
What would help unstick that?
The problem is the landowner is not able to make decisions or act on the project. And I guess he's under court order to sell the project, but he's resisting that.
Yeah, thank you. Any other thoughts?
I found it interesting when you were saying that you're looking at comparative practices, best practices around the country, that you're looking at two extremely sprawling urban areas, the two you mentioned, the Bay Area and Seattle. And I thought it was interesting that you didn't mention Portland, Oregon, which is clearly one of the best examples of growth management that we've seen in the last 25 years in the country. I think when you look at Massachusetts, you're going to need to look at models of growth management in comparable density state and metropolitan areas, which are quite different in Boston, say, and Seattle or San Francisco. There are many common characteristics, but typically, one of the issues that always comes up in Massachusetts is the vast proliferation of municipalities, for example, within 128, and a lot of the intergovernmental issues that you really have to coordinate in order to get coordinated smart growth across town boundaries. And that's where I think the Portland example is a very good one, where they set up a regional government to overcome some of those issues of municipal boundaries. Obviously, your charge is to look at the whole state, so it includes a number of metropolitan areas like Worcester and Pittsfield, as well as smaller areas. But since much of the population is dominated by the Boston metropolitan area, I think that's a very important place to start.
Well, thank you. I think that's a great observation you made about the kinds of areas that we looked at. And I will point out that in part because they are sprawling regions, San Francisco and Seattle, although I will say Seattle is, in size very comparable to Boston and has done a lot to, in terms of building new density. Because they're grappling with this issue, they're in a similar way. They have strong municipalities. They have strong sort of outward sprawling pressures. They've created some very interesting models to get their arms around it. Ones that, unlike Portland, and to be honest, yes, we decided not to look at Portland because we didn't feel that it was a very comparable situation. It's not likely that we're going to be able to get a growth boundary here in the Boston area. In fact, impossible. and really difficult to set up a regional government. I mean, we're part of the, Massachusetts has gotten rid of its counties rather than strengthen them in any meaningful way. Our regional planning agencies don't have any regulatory authority at all. So when you're given weak institutions, what can be done? And that's really why we came to look at some of these models. But I agree that the intergovernmental issues are really strong ones, and I do think as part of the policy we need to strengthen them. I think the Federal Sustainable Communities Grant is an opportunity for us to actually resource the regional planning agency to get more involved in the implementation of things that happened. Any other thoughts that folks want to throw out there at this time? Well, after we collect all this information, we're going to be designing a program. And that program, I think will have some elements that we know. We'll continue to be doing our policy work, and we'll be trying to connect the local work to the policy work. We'll continue to try to advocate for systemic solutions to barriers that are identified at the local level. But we'll also provide some direct technical assistance and support for the folks who are working on the ground. One example of this is that there may be, there's a lot of local planning and organizing capacity, but oftentimes there's not the resources to connect to the state and federal level. Not the resources to be sort of hounding the to find the resources, get the projects lined up in the pipeline for funding, and that's where we can, I think, be helpful, as well as provide local folks with the opportunity to connect with each other and do some learning. I see time and again, communities are really reinventing the wheel. I mean, they're struggling with similar issues, and yet they're trying to do it, and they may get some special, an earmark here or a home rule petition there. But what's very necessary is is just solving the problem, not just passing it along. So, in part, we're trying to, during the program design piece, we're also going to be looking to develop a toolkit. What are some of the resources that local folks who are trying to get developments done on the ground need? And again, I throw up there some thoughts that we have about what might be useful for folks. It could be speakers on a particular topic that folks need to learn more about. It could be GIS, strategizing around affordable housing development issues, message development, legal support, political interference, and by this I often mean, if it's a community-driven initiative, there's oftentimes tensions with the municipality, and sometimes it might be helpful for sort of a third party to help support what's being done there. And then what I just mentioned, the regulatory and legislative strategies as well. So I'll pause again for just a moment. Are there other tools that people can think of that would be particularly helpful? You're familiar with efforts to, in your own community, to get projects done that have stalled. What are the kinds of things that could be useful to help overcome those problems?
Have you looked at using competition to relate with the community around potential ideas for development?
Competition for the resources?
To kind of collect those resources and create a resource, I guess, that inspires potential growth.
Can you explain that a little bit more?
Part of getting a community group together
Mm-hmm.
to collectively envision what can happen with landowners as well as with the community, to use a competition and design ideas.
Oh, I see, okay. No, but that's a good idea. I mean, one thing we have thought about since the Boston Society of Architects is one of our member groups, and in part what we're trying to do is identify the resources that each of our member groups bring to the table. I mean, the BSA has done, charrettes before, and it's something that we might be able to try to look at doing again. Any other thoughts? Well, and then finally, in terms of what we're trying to do in this first year is to set up processes around data collection and evaluation so that we can really understand, identify whether we're being effective and whether what we're doing is replicable. We do have funding to work in Greater Boston, so that is where we're going to be beginning, but we hope that it's a model that will be replicable in other parts of the state as well. So in terms of our timeline for this year, just we're just a few months in. We're drafting a lot of the research that we've done around the national best practices, although we're always open to looking at other other cases. And we've started to look at what are some of the opportunity areas, really the development opportunity areas in the Boston region. And we understand that there may be, folks are going to be at different time frames. So there, project like North Point, the planning has been done, construction has been stalled. That's very different than a project that's in the visioning stage. And ideally, we'd like to work with a variety of efforts so that we can understand how to push them along at the different stages and be supportive of them. So we're already a little bit behind here. I would say that we're not going to be finishing up the areas research next month, and our convening is not in May, but it's in June. So we're pushing it a little bit more into the summer. But generally, this is what we're trying to do. So in the fall is really when we would hope to have the program in place to start it up. So, and just as a last note, the convening that I mentioned at the beginning is going to be held on June 10th. It's probably going to be in the morning at the Wentworth. So again, we're still working on the agenda, the specific agenda, and if you have registered and left your email address, we'll follow up with all of you to make sure you have that information. So I'm going to leave the presentation there. But I wanted to have the opportunity to take questions and continue the discussion. There's probably a lot that hasn't been discussed. I'll take other questions too about the Smart Growth Alliance or smart growth policies in general, if people are interested. Thoughts, questions? 40B? Well, that's an interesting and relevant question for right now. I don't know if all of you are familiar with this, but Chapter 40B is a law that Massachusetts has, which is sort of originally called anti-snob zoning law. And the idea was to help promote affordable housing in municipalities across the state so that no municipality could put in place exclusive zoning and keep out affordable housing. And interestingly enough, with housing production being so difficult in this state over the last 10, 15 years or so, 40B has really been the engine for housing production in the state. It's generated more housing units than any other housing program that the state has. So there are some very large projects that have been proposed under Chapter 40B, and 40B regulations, essentially what it does is that if it's not possible to work through the municipality's rules, it enables you to kind of go to the state and get, basically overrule local zoning. And this has caused some tension with some local folks and local governments that feel that they can't control the development in their community. So there's a ballot initiative that's been proposed for this year to repeal it. The problem is, from our perspective, is that if you take that away, then you're further restricting housing production, particularly affordable housing production. And so we are supportive of retaining Chapter 40B. We feel it's important. There have been a lot of improvements to the law already in terms of making sure that it conforms more to local planning, and there are probably other improvements that could be made, but it's a very important tool that we don't want to lose completely. Someone else had a question up there?
It was mentioned earlier that employment is an important characteristic.
Yes.
Speak a little bit more about how that almost seems that affordable and viable employment opportunities should be a driving force for housing as much as, urban neighborhoods.
Yes.
Travel issue is obviously one of the critical smart growth challenges.
Yes, I think one of the criteria is going to be the sort of job creation or economic development potential of an area. You're absolutely right that, and we haven't done a good job in this state of dealing with that issue. Generally, all of our economic development work is siloed away from our transportation and from our sort of housing and land use programs. And so oftentimes, I mean, for the last few administrations, we really have one hand of the administration is trying to create jobs wherever it can, and the other hand is trying to, again, create, equitable, sustainable places. But oftentimes you're sort of encouraging development where the jobs are being created are oftentimes around the 495 belt, which are really inducing regional sprawl. So how do we get our hands around that? That's a good question. I think that jobs, the location of jobs is just as much a trip generator as housing is. That certainly is true. So we need to figure out how we handle that. We've started to take a look at that, but there is a lot more to do. We need to create jobs in places where people live, or at the very least, create transportation opportunities for people to get to the job locations. I've done a lot of work in Lawrence, for example, and I lived in Lawrence for a while as well. And if you're standing at the Lawrence-Andover municipal line at 5 p.m., the traffic is all log jammed going into the city, not out of the city, because all the jobs are in Andover, and a lot of the people working the jobs are in Lawrence. So, we're not going to be able to reverse that situation. We can make Lawrence a more economically viable city, I think, for sure. We can make it an attractor of population and jobs. But at the same time, we need to deal with the reality that we need to connect people to jobs, in particular in these mill cities where there's a lot of immigrants. People may not even have access to cars. Transportation barriers are one of the reasons why there's high unemployment in those places.
Along those lines, but on a smaller scale, what sort of role, or just what thoughts in general do you have the role of community or vibrant communities, locally owned businesses in their downtown areas? Because I think a sense of place a lot of times, a sense of community a lot of times ties to those types of places. They can be gathering places and the owners that just I think they add a lot to those sense of community being. Plus, they make communities look sustainable. Within the community.
All right, I totally agree with that. I don't know if I have anything interesting. I'll think about it a little bit, see if I have anything interesting to say about that, but I agree. If, one of the things that, some municipalities have tried to do is, not allow, particularly in town centers, chain locations, because obviously, they come in, they have sort of a way they do it around the country, and it's parking all around, and it's the, McDonald's or whatever it is, Walgreens, far away from that. So you really have to fight it locally to get that changed. It's difficult.
I just want to make a point that we don't always have to develop. I mean, as we're considering smart growth, which is a very noble initiative, there are shrinking cities.
Mm-hmm.
There are places like Back Bay or Street that are being demolished all across the U.S. So
Well, just, I mean, a couple of thoughts about that. I do agree. There are cities that are shrinking, and there's a whole, particularly in the Midwest, a lot of these big industrial centers that are shrinking. But if you take a look at their regions, the regions aren't shrinking. If you look at Detroit, Detroit has shrunk a lot, but the metropolitan Detroit region has not shrunk. It's just shifted population from one part of the region to another. So I think there's definitely a question about the role that those cities play within their regions and what you should, they need to do planning for being a smaller city, right? But, but I think the growth issue is really one we're not becoming a smaller country. And so I think that unless we are proactive about figuring out where the growth is going to go, it's going to happen in places we don't want it to happen.
So do you believe there's no link between a place like Boston city development and expansion and sprawl and the shrinking of the rest of our old cities?
Well, like I said, many of those old cities aren't shrinking. I mean, Lawrence is growing in population.
It's well known that these cities, people do leave those cities. They don't leave the suburbs. They also leave to Boston, New York, LA, San Francisco.
Well, yeah, I mean, don't need to discuss that, I guess, or argue about that. There's very few cities in Massachusetts that are shrinking, I would say. I mean, the problem is bigger in Ohio, right? I mean, only Columbus is the only city in Ohio that's growing as a core city. But again, you're talking about the core. I mean, population is shifting around the region. It's not going away, not leaving the country. But
I know you can't solve all the problems, but as far as education, how does that play into what you're doing? Because 90% of people choose where they're doing something. I don't know, a lot of people choose where they're going to live based on schools, and I know in cities in particular,
mm-hmm.
there's a busing option, neighborhood school. I mean, there's so many factors, but is that something that you're working with?
Right. Well, you're absolutely right. The public education system is a big determinant of where people move around the region, right? Particularly when they have families. And I think the challenge with smart growth, again, is it could be everything, right? So we really have to narrow down. And we focus on the built environment and the relationship between people and their built environment. So we feel we can do that. And even that's pretty broad. You're talking about housing, transportation, climate change, some public health issues, et cetera. The workforce development issue and the jobs issue, as well as the school reform and public education issue, those are big issues that drive this stuff. We are not going to be able to get our arms around it completely, although I think, personally, very supportive of some of the reform efforts that have been made. We had an important education reform bill just passed in the state, and I think that's good. I think we need to have more competition, particularly in our older cities, to create, good educational opportunities. Again, I lived in Lawrence. I mean, there's a bunch of new schools that have come up there, both charter and private schools that have been established in Lawrence over the last 5-10 years. That's a good thing. Any other thoughts? So, yes.
How much does the age of the buildings in the area have to do with how much you're willing to emphasize efforts on growth? Like for a lot of Boston, the really old brownstones, people are very proud of that.
Mm-hmm.
And whether or not you want to spend a lot of time trying to build and develop in those areas where there's going to be a lot of people are going to be very apprehensive to demolishing or changing the facade or the feeling of those
Right.
buildings or the height.
Right. Well, let me see if I can. Actually, that picture in the lower right-hand side, this is something that I get very excited about. And those are cottages, right? Those are new cottages. there's a lot of opportunities in our cities to develop single-family homes, but that are more modest in scale than what we've been building, right? I mean, you don't have to build a McMansion. You can build a perfectly good family home that's a lot smaller and has a lot smaller footprint. And we're not building that almost anywhere. And you know, if you look at other places where that are sprawling, sort of a lot of state highways, for example, if you get just off the state highway, like behind the big box store or whatever it is, and you go sort of one or more parcels back from there, there's oftentimes underutilized land that's already been impacted, but is very low density. And those are kinds of places I think would be ripe for some new neighborhoods. They'd be closer to the amenities along the strip, and yet you can create some nice looking stuff. But you know, I agree, that's a very delicate issue. I mean, town centers, I'm really pressed to think of a town that, maybe some of you know, but that's been able to develop their town center in a way that accommodates growth at the same time that it really enhances the town center. It's a challenge. I mean, being proactive about it, developing design standards for the district, for the town center, that can be really helpful. And that way you're setting out sort of where does the growth go and what does it look like? And you're saying, okay, we agreed to this. You know, then you can solicit, developers also come in, they appreciate the predictability, they know what they can build. So I guess the last thing that I would say for all of you, I invited you to the convening, but if some of you are involved with the Boston Society of Architects as well, it'd be interesting to figure out how we can how we can continue the conversation in a more intensive way and bring the resources of the Boston Society of Architects to actually participate in some of these, getting some of these local projects done. So I don't know whether that's the Urban Design Committee. I think we want to have a conversation there, or maybe at Build Boston in November we can have some. By then we'll have sort of the program more built out. We'll have an idea. We'll know where we're going to be working, and I think we can have some of the local partners involved and really talk more specifically about how to plug people in. So, thank you very much for coming.